So welcome everybody to our Wednesday night community conversation. Tonight we're going to focus on microtransit, which is a critical issue. Vermont's an unusual state in that we're so rural that a lot of the standard public transit options apply in some parts of our state, but not in most of our state. So this is there's a lot of great thinking going on about this, and two of the microtransit thought leaders in our state are here with us tonight. Dan Jones from the Sustainable Montpelier Coalition and Ross MacDonald from the Agency of Transportation, where he is the public transit program manager. And so we're looking forward to a great conversation. And with that, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Steve, and hello, everyone. In a little switch, although we will get around to it, the reason we're interested in microtransit as Sustainable Montpelier actually has more to do with energy and land use. So I wanted to give some background on where we're coming from and why in microtransit we think is a major opportunity in the state, and we're grateful to have the state going along with it. And this all started about 6 years ago when the city of Montpelier chose to decide that it was going to be net zero by 2030, although it didn't quite know what that meant. And there was a bit of hoopla around this. It looked like this was a positive direction. There was only one problem with this, which was that Montpelier actually was totally dependent on the car. Okay, it had traffic jams every afternoon of the workday. It had a very small fixed scheduled bus system, and it had acres of parking in town, which did not bode well for a town that was going to try and figure out how to be net zero in any kind of reasonable future. So, in fact, there was so much parking in town that we discovered this is a map of downtown Montpelier, actually a drone shot, and all the red on the map is off-street parking. So you get an idea of how much the real estate in downtown Montpelier is dedicated to housing the car. That's a very difficult position if what you're trying to do is figure out how to be net zero, since over 50% of Vermont's petroleum demand, CO2 demand, comes from transportation. So this is a town that was totally dependent on the burning of fossil fuels. So some of us started to say, well, how can we make a difference in this? What could be done? And we were discovering that actually a principle that isn't often talked about, that land use equals energy use, that we live in a rural sprawl situation. For instance, and even in Montpelier, we're dependent on the car. There's 6,500 cars for 4,000 households in Montpelier. So, and that's a town which is still relatively dense compared to Vermont. The city perceives parking as an economic necessity, and public transit is perceived as a charity. It is something that is provided at a high cost for those people who cannot afford a car. It also means in a town like Montpelier, there's very little downtown public green space. Even though we have a lovely river, we can't get to it. So we're in a situation where we couldn't figure out how do we change this. And a lot of us were beginning to talk on the whole issue of smart growth. You know, how to mix land uses, how to take advantage of building design, have more housing opportunities. You can't house people on parking lots, as it were. How do you create walkable neighborhoods? Foster distinctive, attractive communities, and then provide a variety of transportation choices where we had one and an occasional bus. And then encourage community and stakeholder collaboration. So that last part got us thinking about, well, how would we actually do this? And we came up with the idea of having a design competition. So some of you may have heard about it, the Sustainable Montpelier Design Competition back in 2016-17. And we actually got designs submitted from around the world on how we could have a more sustainable downtown, filling in that space, making more use of it. And we invited the public to be the judges in this. So we had 2 rounds of judges, and we put up a pop-up gallery downtown, which you can see here, where people actually came through, and took this very seriously. I mean, there was a lot of public discussion on it. It was fascinating. And we had a competitive voting. And what we had was this design here, which actually looked at the whole riverfront and had parking basically down here at the each end of town, and then filled in the downtown more with housing, commercial space, and put in new housing spaces along the river, so that we made use of the actual rail link that traveled through the middle of town. So this was a great idea. It had a lot of support, but it was just an idea. So we needed to figure out how to go from vision to action. And in 2017, we created the Sustainable Montpelier Coalition, which we defined ourselves as a mechanism for being a catalyst for change. We weren't necessarily going to be the developer or any of this, but we were going to try and get the process going to make changes. So we began an organizing effort with city businesses, community groups to explore alternatives on how we do things. We started doing sort of public postings, op-eds, etc., to get the understanding that land use does equal energy use. And in the final step in the year, we organized Community Transportation Coalition Roundtable to examine alternatives for getting people downtown without cars. And that included the rail line, that included remote parking, and it included this new concept of microtransit. And we realized a new transit system's got to be convenient and cheap. Local residents have to be able to find this actually preferable. It's, you know, because we were actually only looking at how do we deal with in Montpelier. We were not trying to actually get everybody in from central Vermont. Just in Montpelier, we had enough demand for parking that we could make a change. It had to be flexible and affordable. All right. Many of you may know that the AAA estimates that the average Vermonter spends $8,000 per year per car, which is a large amount of money. So especially for seniors who wanted to downsize, people who did not want to be dependent on cars, there's really very few alternatives. And so we had to begin to imagine how that could happen. But this new system also had to provide paratransit for those who needed to get to the hospital, to doctor's visits, etc., and had very paralysis issues, had other age issues. And it had to provide predictable connections to getting in and out of town. So again, we discovered this whole concept of microtransit. And microtransit, for you who are not completely familiar with it, operates on an app. You can see the app for one of the leading companies on the right side. And it basically can tell you, knows where you're calling from, where you want to come from, and where you want to go. You can enter that in. And then it will basically ship off a van or small bus to where you are. But it's also very smart that it knows that other people in your neighborhood also want to be traveling roughly in the same direction. It's 8 in the morning and a bunch of people want to get downtown. So it knows how to actually do the best routing to pick up multiple people, get them into town or to their destinations simultaneously, so that it reduces the number of cars and is pretty much almost as convenient as your car. It won't pick you up at your door. It might be in the middle of the block, but it's certainly better than walking 4 blocks to a bus stop and waiting. I'm not sure when they, and you can, like on Uber or Lyft, you can actually look at the app and see where the ride is, so you can be pretty well prepared for when it's going to arrive. It's very affordable, and so we thought this was a really great idea, and we would like to see it happen. And the Community Transportation Coalition, helped create that perception through the roundtables that there was a alternative was worth piloting. And the idea of VTrans actually got discussed in some areas of the state government. And a couple of years ago, Ross called me up and said, well, I'm happy to tell you that we're going to have a working group within VTrans to explore what microtransit might mean for Montpelier. And oh, surprise, Sustainable Montpelier is going to be basically doing most of the work. So we were delighted with this, and we spent the last about a year and a half with the working group doing the research necessary on what was happening, and created a white paper that recommended the pilot project. That passed the legislature in the session earlier this year, and we're moving forward. And Ross is going to talk more about that, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. What we did was a lot of research and development. We had to find out, where is microtransit succeeding and where is it failing? What are the problems with it? What are the possibilities? Who are the most reliable providers? How cost effective can it really be? How easy is it for public transit agencies to add this as a service? Because it does completely change the nature of what they're doing. And does it make a difference? And we were happy to discover that in places, one of the best test cases we found was West Sacramento, California, where they're actually, really made a difference in not only people's perception of the transit, but in the number of people using it. In fact, it was growing very rapidly when last we checked. So it has a great possibility for actually changing people's perception of transit and how they manage to use it, how they schedule their lives around it. So VTrans and Sustainable Montpelier are building a public-private partnership to ensure a community embrace. We've helped form a community advisory council within town, which means that the town, various sectors will be involved in actually monitoring what goes on, trying to determine the best practices, advise the provider, Green Mountain Transit in this case, on how to really better serve the community. And we're going to be offering a education and engagement process with multiple strategies. And for this, I have to thank Senators Ash and Perchlik, who helped put in some language and funding into the transportation bill that allows for funding of this kind of work so that we can actually be serious about it, reach out to the public. Our first step will be what we call recruiting the do no harm folks, the people who have to use transit right now. So we have to figure out how to get in touch with them, how to get them using it, how that they're going to be integral to the operation. And then we'll spread out to the seniors and get them educated and involved. And we have to do all of this within and build a sense of value within the COVID world, because the safety of the service along with the cost savings has to be paramount. And we actually feel pretty happy about this because we discovered back this earlier in the COVID problem when the GMT was really limiting the number of people on any given bus, that they would have stop in front of the main stop in front of Shaw's downtown, and there might be 4 people waiting. They'd only allow 2 on, and that those other 2 would have to wait for an hour for the bus to get back, which was not actually serving their needs. So it turns out in a microtransit world, the vehicle could have done a fairly quick trip, taking the people where they had to go and gotten back to pick up the other 2. So it makes a big difference in our understanding of scheduling, how we can get people using it, how it might happen within the future. Now, we have goals, okay? And our goals and for the microtransit in Montpelier are, we'd like to eliminate the need for 2,000 second cars, because there are 2,000 second cars in Montpelier. There are 4,000 first cars. Now, if we could eliminate those 2,000 second cars using that $8,000 a year number from AAA, which of course no Vermonter pays $8,000 a year, but that's AAA's number, that could mean a savings of $16 million for residents through the reduction in car use. It would then allow some of the parking dedicated real estate downtown to be redeveloped for denser village center work and reimagined streetscapes, a lot more great green space, etc. And it would create new economic options for transportation systems so that we could go beyond just the microtransit, but we might be able to have a car share that actually worked, bike share, other options. So it's a way of beginning to really have a systems approach to the whole option of how do we get people in and out of town, how do we get them around, and what can they do. So that's our our overall plan. We're attempting to provide a systems approach to land and energy use, which says that microtransit is the best available option in a dense center like Montpelier. We're waiting for other options to figure out how to get to the outer burbs, but just within Montpelier, we could make a huge difference in the amount of demand downtown if we could just get the people in town using it. It's a manageable scale within existing resources, so we're not looking at something that is a brand new fleet of electric vehicles, or et cetera. As a matter of fact, electric vehicles, if we did all the transfer of individual vehicles, electric vehicles, it would still demand the same amount of parking space downtown. So this was a different approach to try and get rid of the concept of the single occupancy vehicle always being the use, and figure out how to get more shared resources. And we call it a new economy concept, where we begin to develop the concept of access over ownership. Can we access the services we need rather than do we actually have to own them individually? So that's the basic concept of microtransit, and thank you for your attention.
Fabulous. Thanks, Dan. I love your engagement of your community in making all that happen. So now we'll switch right over to Ross.
Thank you for having me. And Dan has been a force of nature for years, trying to guide us in considering all of these smart jitney, microtransit, whatever he has identified with his group as ways to address the land use issues. Anytime I get to talk to an environmental community is heartening for me. I started my government career with the EPA in New Jersey, and continue to understand that it all comes down to land use. And we want to do our part in terms of transit and achieving that mobility that Dan is speaking about. But if anything, I'd like to just kind of start a little bit about talking about the pandemic, its effects on our services, how we're able to potentially rebuild, what we're doing in the space of technology and better information. We'll get right into microtransit. But right away, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about that pandemic, where our ridership went down by 80%. We needed to put shower curtains next to our drivers and work with the governor to try to get a mask mandate, which we were successful. We are now putting up Lexan barriers to ensure social distancing, and our ridership is up to about 50%. That still allows us to potentially restart some of these routes and reimagine some of these services. Where microtransit has been considered for the last couple of years, as Dan talks about, we're prepared to move forward in a really concerted and coordinated way to have the community involvement that we are soon to be experiencing with this pilot has been identified as the #1 component or variable to guarantee success or not with these new launches of microtransit services. There's no shortage of options and opportunities out there when it comes to microtransit. This is the dynamic that is an offshoot from the biggest disruptor in transportation in the last 20 years, which is the TNCs, the transportation network companies, the Uber and the Lyft. There's something there. The market has spoken. And how do we incorporate and integrate those types of services for more people, for more reasons in our communities? So this is a good opportunity to see what it's going to look like with the Sustainable Montpelier Coalition working with us, with the legislature very keen. Our governor also is very aware of this project. It all makes sense on paper, but that's no guarantee of a new way for mobility in rural areas. In fact, this microtransit project will be in one of the smaller communities ever to try it in the country. You know, how low can we go when we think about serving a percentage of population that is still going to make sense on a per mile, per person cost? But we've seen enough to know that it's time to move and to represent rural America with this type of pilot. And anyone can understand that instead of running around a circular route, hoping people are going to get on, hoping that we anticipated where they're going to be getting off, we want to serve a region. And anybody in that region can go anywhere in that region with their smartphone or by calling an 800 number. So what will that look like? We know that we have demand response services now that are serving that area, and that thousands of trips are happening within a 5.5, 6 square mile area in Montpelier. They are for the Medicaid clients, they are for the elderly, older Vermonters, and persons with disabilities. What if we were, it also is costly. It also requires 24 to 48 hour reservations. So it's not very responsive to those needs that pop up. So this is a great way to potentially bring all of the general public, Medicaid clients, our older Vermonters, persons with disabilities, general public, commuters, all using the same mode. And we don't have to bifurcate. This is fixed use, this is demand response. No, this is mobility in your region and in your community. So we're hopeful that overall costs would be about the same, with potentially more ridership and a better service. What would that look like? It would mean that maybe people would get rid of their second cars. Tremendous environmental impacts on those, that would reveal. Getting people not to have to work in this city, live in the city, and that 2-mile commute is taking up all that valuable, all that space and that real estate. So we are committed to finding out what it would look like if we took 3 routes. One that goes to Hospital Hill from downtown, which serves the Central Vermont Medical Center, the in-town circulator, and the Capital Shuttle, which only operates during the legislative session, and combine those, take those resources and invest in a microtransit pilot. That's the intention. That's what we'll be doing. GMT is the provider. They will be contracting for the software using their vehicles. Hopefully the new EV vehicles will be online to be used for this particular pilot. And they have put out the request for proposals, and we have somebody from the Sustainable Montpelier Coalition participating on the contract selection committee, as well as one of my staff members who's far more technical savvy than myself. And we've received 11 proposals. This is not a big market. It's not something that represents a tremendous way forward in terms of dollars for these companies, but they know that this could be the rural answer to mobility, and everybody understands that Vermont, unlike so many other rural areas, does have the backing and the finance to invest in these types of modes and pilot projects. So we'll choose one of those 11 proposals, we'll negotiate, and we would like to launch beginning of calendar year 21. Then, concurrent to that, we will be working through the legislature and developing our grant program, as Dan had mentioned. In the period of COVID, we know that one thing that's happened is that it has demonstrated the value of public transit, essential services for essential workers, essential services for those who can't get to those services otherwise. That has really elevated the understanding and potential approach in an aggressive way, where the legislature not only fully funded us in a time when they're only funding some areas for Q1, Q2, we're going back to the legislature to do scenario planning in just a few weeks here, or just next week. However, we received full funding plus another $500,000 in state funds, which are like hen's teeth, to invest in community PDM, transportation demand management, and microtransit-like programs and services. We've heard a lot of good ideas from around the state. We want to further engage with these communities, really using Dan Jones and the SMC as a pilot or a case study in terms of ongoing, consistent, years-long engagement, along with working with us and contracting with us to execute a portion of the outreach. That local comfort and credibility will not be replaced by ads in your paper or by posts from me on Front Porch Forum. So we really do need the community to work with us and get those early adopters to convince these neighborhoods to try these new modes out. What is it going to mean environmentally? Well, rather than these buses traveling around with nobody on them, when nobody's on the bus, they certainly aren't burning miles. They'll be going to their areas where they will be staged for walk-ups, or regardless, they won't be just in motion for motion's sake. If we can increase ridership, that cost per person, all of a sudden we could get a 30% increase in ridership. We could see significant savings in the per person cost in those trips. Now, when you start talking about getting rid of cars, higher, better uses in your downtown areas, those numbers I haven't calculated. A lot of people have taken an attempt to bring those nuances, that algorithm together. We know that there's tremendous opportunity with better use of our land. So, so far so good. GMT is on board. We have the funding in place to pursue this pilot for the next 2 years. And then, of course, everything else is up for grabs, for discussion, and for consideration as we try to deal with the economic fallout and the new budget pressures that we're all facing at the state level. But regardless of all these conversations, I've been in a lot of tough budget discussions. Microtransit is unassailable and has not been discussed as anything other than let's make sure that we do our due diligence on here, because this could be a more meaningful way to provide mobility throughout the state. So a lot is riding on this pilot, and I really appreciate Rob, Kidd, and Steve, and the group bringing us in here to talk about it. Be happy to answer any questions and hear your perspectives as you consider this change in mobility services.
Well, fantastic, Ross. Thanks so much. It's great to see that the state and local folks are working together on this. We do have a couple of questions that are rolling in. People, if you have questions, we're going to first go to those that are that have come in through chat, and whether you type your whole question into chat or just maybe give us a topic or say you have a question, we'll get to you if we can. And our first question comes from Andrea Stander.
Thanks for giving me the chance to ask this question. I'm the primary caregiver for my 89-year-old mom. I'm also part of a community group that is working on a program for helping seniors in the city get the help that they need to do various things. Our survey of seniors in Montpelier, so people over 55 in Montpelier, put transportation as a absolute top priority, access to transportation. So my question is, how does the app and or alternatives to the app work so that older folks, people with physical limitations, technology limitations, things of that sort, would be able to access it?
Sure, thank you. Andrea, this is happening across, the older states. Vermont is among the oldest throughout the country, right? But in our public transit policy plan that we just published in the beginning of this calendar year, transportation was identified as one of the top 2 issues in childcare, in aging, in healthcare, in so many areas. And we know the importance of trying to change our services to meet the increasing demand of the aging population. That is number one, something that we need to address clearly. We think that this microtransit approach could be a way forward. So whether or not an 89-year-old person is on Medicaid or qualifies for an elderly disabled program or is part of the general public, they will have an 800 phone number or an app. I'm proud to say my 81-year-old father is using Uber and Lyft instead of transit. I'm agnostic about that, I guess. But but more and more of the aging population is comfortable with smartphones and are using them and are understanding the value that it can be to many people aging, social, not least of which. So there will be a profile when your mother books a ride. We will know: do we need a wheelchair placement? Is there special needs? Is there a client caregiver that is associated with that ride? That will all be as part of building the profile of that customer. I've also seen, what about costs, right? At this point, we're expecting a fare within a 5.5 square mile region or so in Montpelier to cost $2 fare. No fares paid for the public transit service. At least 85% of all cost of a transit trip is borne by federal and state resources. The fares do help, and we're expecting maybe a $2 fare. We can work with the Medicaid program and the elderly and disabled programs to provide vouchers, to have alternative billing for those types of trips. But overall, it should be an improvement and an expansion of mobility for those who are now limited to just the demand response services in place right now.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up question?
Please.
Go right ahead.
With the 800 number, is that going to connect people to an automated system or to an actual person?
I think that needs to be a person, Andrea, because somebody's
agree.
calling because they're not comfortable with the technology, they're not comfortable with the trip or some of the rules therein. So we expect that would go to GMT's call center unless one of those proposals can offer a reasonable call center interface. We expect a human to process those calls, certainly through the pilot project.
And
we need to learn from those calls.
If I can jump in a second on Andrea, the GMT is really looking to improve its call center service. It doesn't feel, it knows it has not got a great reputation for that, but that it understands for this, and especially for the population you're talking about specifically, people sometimes are more comfortable with the phone than they are with smartphones. And so that will be part of our sort of outreach and education effort leading up to the service as well.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. Next we go to Scott. Scott's posted a question here. Scott Weathers.
Yeah, I could read it out if it's easier. I mean,
Great.
basically the question that I have is I'm curious if systems like microtransit systems like VIA actually do they actually reduce the net number of rides and number of cars on the road, or do folks end up actually taking more rides because if there is this option that's so great that's available, could that actually increase carbon emissions overall? I don't know the answer to this, but I know that there have been some studies on Uber specifically, and that the impact of Uber has been on traffic has been in some cities harmful because people end up just taking more rides, basically.
I can answer.
More miles. Go ahead, Dan.
Our understanding, and this is, we're far from sure on this. We've heard the same studies from Uber and Lyft. Oftentimes in a younger circumstance, what we've heard on VIA is because of the shared Lyft thing, that it is considered somewhat slower than Uber, but it's the cost benefit is such that the people who use it tend not to be repeating rides as much, that they're actually trying to get someplace rather than this. So and also remember, we're in a much different circumstance. We're in a little city like Montpelier. This is not New York or Cambridge or whatever, where I could walk 2 blocks or I can take the Uber. No, it's a different environment entirely.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and just I agree with Dan, and we'll see. I think this is why we do pilots through our surveys before, during, and after. We'll try to gauge, are we providing more mobility? Are people getting rid of their cars? If they're getting rid of their cars and they're not driving the 4, 7, 9,000 miles a year, and they're using this as their secondary car, I mean, the environmental footprint there is important, as well as that better and higher land use. If we can put some housing in the middle of town where people are actually able to live in town where they work instead of living in Waitsfield, well, I mean, all of a sudden, you know, you get these economies of scale. We'll try to capture as many of those variables as we can. We know the environmental profile is not least to be considered.
Thanks.
Great. Well, I think we've got a question from Richard.
Okay, I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Apparently, a major goal is to eliminate private car use in a small town, small city such as Montpelier, and not necessarily to bring people in. It seems like you're not talking about bringing the person in from Waitsfield. We're talking about circulation within Montpelier.
Yeah, when we talk about first mile, last mile, we have, as you know, the Link Express that before COVID was pulling in 200 plus people a day on those services. Another 50 or 60 coming from the Waterbury area. US 2 commuter, Link Express. We had those things. We're hoping that we'll have more of that ridership coming into the area, because once they're in that town, they can get around a little bit easier than having to then rely on this hour-long circulator to get to their final destination. So really it's to augment and to enhance that feeder service, if you will, as well as provide more mobility for those in that region. So once you get to that region, maybe you didn't have to take your car because you can get around by Microtransit.
I see. That makes sense.
Also, Richard, I would say that I don't expect people to get rid of their cars entirely, but we get rid of some of those second and third cars. We can start maybe looking at that behavior change of people getting more comfortable with getting out of their cars, using public transit mobility services that are out there. That could mean a lot of things over the next, over the long term, let's say.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. We had a question from Brian about fares. Brian.
Yes, you answered part of it with the $2 fare that you're talking about. And I was also wondering about discounts for seniors that the Green Mountain Transit had. And I was also curious that Green Mountain Transit was considering going to free ridership because their funding and their grants were dependent upon number of passengers rather than the cost of service. And it also saves so much money with their token machines and slowing down the ride because of putting coins in and fares and all that. So they were considering going free. I'm wondering why this is not considered just being a tax issue.
Sure, I appreciate that, Brian. And this has been one of the main items that we've been asked to study by the legislature. And so we had the public transit policy plan. We talked about fare free and what that would look like, what we spend now on fare collection and the like. We also were asked to do a legislative study on how to increase usage of our public transit system. Better information. We have better information. The transit app, as many people know, is available throughout the state. But right now, we receive about $2.4, $2.6 million in fares from our urban system, but only about $560,000 in fares from our rural systems. A lot of that lower ridership, but also a lot of those rural systems have those partnerships at the local level. Dartmouth Hitchcock comes to mind. some tourist routes, Stowe and the like, where they are generating those local dollars that they need to match the state and federal grant dollars through other local resources than fares. There's a lot of people in the legislature who would like to see it go fare-free. It is healthier, less contact. It is easier to operate. We don't exchange monies every night and go to the banks. We don't have to pay for fare boxes, and it is truly universal. There's a lot of people in the legislature who say, hey, here's the service out there. People pay for registration. People pay for, these other, health care and everything else. Why wouldn't they have to pay and put some skin in the game for their trips? I understand both perspectives. For me, just speaking as the public transit person, I'm confident that fare-free would be the easiest way to generate more ridership on our services as they stand. And as we grew, if we were to develop these modes and offer them for free, it would be a lot easier to convince people to get on them. When we put this microtransit program together, we were not fare-free. We were just considering it. It is something that we'll be looking at over the next several months. For now, we will be going fare-free in the rural area through December into January, and then we'll see where our budget numbers are and if we can continue through the end of fiscal year 21. It's unfortunate that COVID happened, because if we could do a fare-free analysis without that, with our regular ridership, it would have taught us and told us a lot more than during these extraordinary times. But that's really the fair perspective right now, I think, from the agency.
Yeah, well, making the rural route where you're having your ridership issue free makes a lot of sense, and people are used to paying for it in the urban loop. So that sounds like a good system.
I'd like to jump in here for a second, Steve, if I could, on this. One of the things that we've been working with in the concept of public transit for a long time is actually having a very limited number of people who are using this compared to the larger population. If we are successful with hopefully getting a much broader use by the population with microtransit, more demand for it, then we actually have to talk about, at least for those of us who can afford it, some form of fare, because we're then at the point of being able to be saving a bunch of money in other modes. Now, this is not this year or next year, but this is something that I personally want to be exploring, because I think that's going to be key to understanding how do we really make the transition, the long-term transition, away from total dominance of the personal car into something where we have this shared access. And I think it becomes one of the really interesting long-term questions.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Chuck Fenton.
My question is about how your system will respond during disasters, whether it's floods or winter events, and what that impact would be on people that would be isolated during those events.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly this service could represent more control, not only on the supply side, but on the demand side as well. If we need to limit passengers to 50% capacity, it's a lot easier to program that and the algorithms doing the real-time dispatch and scheduling than bus drivers pulling up and asking people to wait. And by the way, Dan, they're only waiting about 10 or 15 minutes because the other bus was already on its way. But no question, we'll be able to better manage those types of limitations on let's say capacity on our buses. The other piece is isolation. If people can't get around 5 days a week, 6 days a week in a small town, maybe this is something where we can go to small towns for 1 or 2 days a week and offer the microtransit type service for Tuesdays and Fridays for 5 or 6 hours a day, just trying to reach more people in more areas where traditional transit just doesn't work. So, and that's where a lot of the older Vermonters are going to be aging. And so how do we branch out and expand the services in some way, in some relative way, to these small communities to in part help with isolation is something to also address.
But also, just one of the things, and specific to that question, I'm just thinking of the snowstorm situation where it's very hard for people to shovel their driveways, et cetera, but the main roads may be open. We may be able to have the public transit working where the individual car is really limited, and that we're able to actually provide service to people more quickly than what's usually required for the amount of time going the side lanes, etc. I mean, just watching this in various places, it is logical that we could actually manage this more efficiently.
Just one more thing I forgot to mention. It's true. If our fares are $2, the senior discount is 50%. It would be $1 for seniors. I forgot to had mentioned that. Sorry about that, Chuck and Brian.
All right, I think Rob Kidd has added a couple of notes in the chat box about this, but I think we're going to go to Jack, another member of our production team, for a question. Jack.
Thank you, and thanks to both of you for this really interesting discussion. I have a question first about timing. Over what period of time are you going to grow this microtransit scheme? Will we be seeing this in the next couple of years? I didn't catch when the wheels are going to start rolling. And then that raises in my mind the question of how long you anticipate it will take to bring about this beautiful transformation of Montpelier, which you illustrated, which is one of the profound outgrowths of this system. Is that something that we would see in 10 years, or what's your ambition for that?
I'm going to answer that in two ways. One is, and Ross will, we're looking to launch the microtransit system in Montpelier in January, this coming January. Okay. It will be a pilot project for the first year or two to see how it works, what the demand is, how we create the demand, et cetera, and then document it for others' experience. We're already seeing something interesting in Montpelier with COVID, where a large number of the parking spots are no longer being filled every day because people are telecommuting. And there's some research that says that may be continuing even after the virus because people are finding that this may be a more efficient way of working. We will see on that. But then it depends on other, and this is why we're having a systems approach to it, to the second part of your question, which is if we can get agreement with building general services, et cetera, to free up some of that land, can we then look to other frames for thereby creating more housing, et cetera, on the vacated land? Could we have new systems that would be perhaps co-op based, et cetera, that would allow us to move more quickly so that we could actually see within 5 to 6 years, hopefully, the actual movement toward the area that we're trying to, the new density that we're trying to encourage.
That's the Montpelier piece. When we look at statewide, we anticipate that Montpelier will be the first pilot to get started. Concurrent to that, we will stack up other communities with other requests for proposals, potentially with other responders or other providers, to figure out if there's a better mousetrap, a best way for rural Vermont to proceed for many of our small towns, Middlebury and Brattleboro and Bennington and Randolph and all these other small, St. Johnsbury, all these other smaller towns that are underserved by transit. And so what we did with our data and our transit app was we did some real-time pilots, one proprietary data, one open source data, another one using Dartmouth Smart Kids. And we were able to identify a cost-effective way moving forward for the state. And as a result, we have a statewide transit app that does provide value to the riders. This is similar to what we probably will be doing in the next 2 to 3 years. When you talk about 10 years, if we are actually helping people make better land use decisions in the planning stages and in the and in those considerations, then when we will be doing our part, and it would be a good day if we're seeing denser, better served mobility in our downtowns that really create the value and start bringing folks who can really recognize the opportunity to live in Montpelier, have one car maybe instead of 2 or 3, and have this access through better transit. If we can get then the bike share, the car share, we might be looking at a mobility as a service rather than a transit route. And this is being done in Europe, and a lot of people have heard about the mobility as a service approach. It's something that is not happening in rural America, but if it's going to happen, Vermont might be the place best suited for that development.
That raises in my mind the question of how small can you go with Montpelier is a pretty small pilot, but there are lots of places around that are only half or a quarter the size of Montpelier. Can you have micro mini transit that is appropriate in the truly small rural communities?
And Jack, and it's funny that you mentioned that. I'm always saying, how low can we go in terms of density served? And so you've got it. And that's why I'm wondering if we have a region with a few small towns and we bring the microtransit service for 2 days in these towns that are maybe half as large as Montpelier or a third as large as Montpelier, and we're serving a certain amount of hours reduced, but people understand that, these 2 days is when I can get out and do shopping, I can get to these areas of town where I usually can't. That's the type of rate sizing we'll have to consider, but it's not free. It's about another $100,000 to $100,000 or $200,000 additional to take those 3 routes in Montpelier and transition them to microtransit in our initial cost estimate, if you will, our ICE. And that being said, we're going to need more riders, more local funds, more federal funds to grow out this new mode. But we think it might be worth it if we can, have more people utilizing the service.
Well, it's interesting that one of the challenges we have, we often hear that Vermont is the most rural state or one of the most rural states, but actually what that means is that we have the most dense rural areas in the country. So we're sort of right. It puts us on a kind of a borderline for, we're not North Dakota. We're not Wyoming, where it's 10 miles from house to house.
Driving through Montana makes me think of, that's a really good point. And it is something that in Vermont, we spend about $12 a person on transit. In Wyoming and those other, it's less than $2. About $1.35 on average in rural states. Again, we're at $12 and I think it was 23, 32 cents. As a result, we do have a level of service that most rural areas don't have. Transitioning 3 routes from Montpelier to microtransit, in most rural areas, they would have no transit in a town like Montpelier, maybe one route, maybe one commuter route. And so we've got, kind of this infrastructure that is going to be able to change with those investments. And I hate to do this, but I say it every time. Our budget's $37 million. We get $8 million for transit, and we match that $8 million with state funds. Nobody else does that. And then we take $19 million from the federal highway program, the bridge and road maintenance and all those things that we complain about. We're grabbing $19 million of that for transit. No other rural state does that. We need to maximize these funds and really find a better way to provide mobility services in our rural areas. And I'm hoping this is a part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have a few questions coming in. Richard has a question about getting to the local concert. Richard, do you want to put that in you want to elaborate on that question a little bit?
Let's say Elvis comes back and he comes to Montpelier and schedules a concert. What's your capacity to move a lot of people around at one time, say to a concert venue and then back home with a system
Well,
like
the
this?
World Cup skiing. Yeah, thank you, Richard. And that's an interesting point. World Cup skiing, 12,000 people served by transit. Everybody's coming together. The fireworks that usually occur in Burlington, all hands on deck. It's one of the busiest nights for GMT. A scenario like this would require GMT to work with for the facility and understand that, hey, we've got all these people coming. They're going to park up in National Life, and we're going to use your microtransit service to get people down here. Those are the types of contracted services that will be at their disposal. If it's during normal hours, as long as we know, one of the beauties of microtransit is putting 2, 3, 7, 17 vehicles on the road, is using the same software and tablets and everything else. And so the scalability should be able to be done for events as well as for reacting to any market changes, hopefully increase in ridership demand. If we have 4 or 5 vehicles on the road that are at capacity and people are having to wait 15, 20 minutes instead of 10 or 15, we can add another vehicle on the road that day and get those times down. That'll be part of the case study analysis, but we expect to be able to serve events like we generally do now, only better.
I think our next questioner is Brian Forrest again.
I was wondering if there's been any discussion about, we talked about repurposing some of the parking spaces. We don't need the parking downtown, to actually banning cars from the city entirely and rethinking the whole relationship between cars and cities.
Let me take that one for a second. You've now figured out the third rail of public discussion in Vermont. The reality is we're trying to, in the Buckminster Filler terms, provide a better idea of how to do things and see whether people will buy in, and then we can have that discussion. But right now, if you were to say banning the cars from downtown Montpelier, you would have the shopkeepers all chasing you down the street with knives and guns. Because we've even suggested just closing the city for the Saturday morning for the farmers market, and the merchants say, well, no, we're losing business. So while it is a valuable discussion in the abstract, until we prove that there is an alternative way of doing things, it ain't happening.
Well, Church Street is a pretty much of a success. Why is it not? Why couldn't that happen in Montpelier?
It's too small a town right now for and we're losing half of our businesses to COVID, so it creates another whole set of crises. And when merchants and et cetera get in that position, they just get very frightened.
Well, and the geometry works for Church Street too.
Yeah,
where you have alternative routes to get around and parking and all those kinds of things, and easy biking.
Right. And Steve, Church Street is one of only a few areas where that actual land use model has worked. In the 70s and 80s when that was put together, that was one of dozens around the country. I guess Iowa and Burlington are about the only two still standing with that type of land use setup.
Boulder, Colorado.
Allowing some cars has been interesting. To be part of like this perceived, well, if I need to drive or whatever, but change is hard, and people are so used to their vehicles that behavior change are the types of conferences I go to. It's not, how to market your services better. It's like how to get people to change behaviors and to act in a way that's environmentally responsible, saving money, and those things. And it's not easy, as Dan's talking about. We've all been at those meetings with the Montpelier businesses, and they want a parking garage. They don't want microtransit.
Well, we are right at the edge. The frontier of behavior change is going to probably affect every single aspect of our lives when it comes to climate change, as it has with COVID. And we are just, I think, with transportation questions, we're up against that. I think that first. We'll be up against it everywhere else too, I think. But thanks. I want to thank Dan and Ross for joining us tonight.